Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's talk, which is part of the Artisan Lecture Series and indeed our spring lectures. Tonight's lecture is presented in partnership with the Huguenot Society of America and in collaboration with the Horological Society of New York and the historic Huguenot Street. And I would like to thank each of these organizations for their support of this lecture. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. We are a non-profit organization, and today our 237-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our General Society Library, which celebrated 200 years fairly recently, our John M. Mossman Law Museum, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and of course, our lecture series. Our lecture series originally started in 1837. Throughout tonight's talk, we will take questions both in person and online. And for our online audience, please feel free to submit typed questions at any point during the lecture and of course at the conclusion. But we do ask that you use the Q&A section rather than raise your hand. Now, to introduce our very special speaker this evening, I am so pleased that we have the president of the Huguenot Society of America, Jason Bernhard, to introduce Tessa Murdoch. Jason, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Karen. It's my pleasure, and I'll be quick because I know people want to get to Tessa, but it's my pleasure to introduce Tessa Murdoch, and thank you for being with us once again. Tessa has had 30 years with the V&A in London, most recently the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert research curator for their collection. Before that, she was the deputy keeper of sculpture, metalwork, and glass at the V&A and lead curator of the Sacred Silver, Stained Glass, and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert galleries. Tessa is currently the chair of trustees of the Huguenot Museum in Rochester, Kent, United Kingdom. I encourage those of you who are making the trip to London, now that we're all traveling more, to stop in and see it. Tessa lectures and writes widely on the history of the decorative arts. Her publications include The Quiet Conquest, Huguenot 1685 to 1985, as well as Huguenot Goldsmiths in Northern Europe and North America. In 2019, Tessa was a recipient of the Getty Rothschild Fellowship. Tessa, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'm now just going to share my screen. And beginning. Sorry, get that out of the way. I hope everybody can see my screen, and I would like to thank Jason for introducing me so generously, and particularly Karen Taylor and her team for welcoming me back to the Mechanics Institute and the opportunity to speak to members of the Huguenot Society of America, to members of historic Huguenot Street, and of course the Horological Society. So given the very special character of the audience this evening, my talk is going to focus particularly on the international contribution made by the Huguenots to the ever-expanding horological industry. And I start by illustrating on the title page of my lecture an exquisite form watch. I believe the Huguenot Society has recently had a talk on watchmakers of Geneva. And this is an example in the Metropolitan Museum here in New York by Antoine Arlot. who was the founder of a dynasty of watchmakers and enamelers who worked in Geneva and across Europe. And it shows beneath the dial the engraved representation of the risen Christ, which seemed rather appropriate for Easter Tuesday. So I share an image of myself looking very pleased at the initial launch of this publication, which took place at Koopman Rare Art, leading silver dealers, now in Mayfair, where a rather interesting selection of Huguenot silver had been placed on display. This was still in sort of COVID restricted times, and so there was a group of only 30 close friends and colleagues who'd contributed to the book. But I would also like to pay tribute to Robert Dalrymple, who I believe has designed a really beautiful illustrated book to celebrate the extraordinary achievement of the Huguenot refugees across Europe and beyond into the New World. And just a word about the cover, which is a beautiful painted mirror by Antoine Monnoyer, whose father was King Louis XIV's flower painter, based in Paris, but as a Protestant was forced to leave the French metropolis because practicing Protestantism in France was outlawed through the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, as you well know, signed by Louis XIV in October 1685. Well, I wanted to remind you that Huguenots settled in England in the first half of the 16th century. So that's 150 years before the revocation. And one of the earliest and talented Huguenots who made London their home was Nicolas Orso, who signed the back of the movement of this great astronomical clock, which was created for Henry VIII's great palace, previously Cardinal Wolsey's, of course, at Hampton Court. And I hope that many of those listening have had the chance to visit in person this spectacular royal palace. But notice the very sophisticated form of the dial with the signs of the zodiac. And remember this, because we will see an 18th century echo of this remarkable clock later on this evening. You will know that the Huguenots were followers of John Calvin, but you may not be familiar with this remarkable contemporary portrait of the theologian, which is preserved in the collection of the de Bouverie family of Walloon, and later very closely linked to the Huguenot community as Earls of Radnor. Many generations of that family were governors of the French Hospital, a charity founded by Huguenot refugees in the early 18th century, which still flourishes today in Rochester, Kent, providing sheltered accommodation for elderly people of proven Huguenot descent. Also in the 16th century, a number of goldsmiths were associated with the first French Protestant church, founded in London in 1550 by royal charter from the young Edward VI, the young Protestant king. And this wine cup was made by Noé Gepard, who is known to have attended the French Protestant church in Threadneedle Street in the heart of the city from its instigation. And he was still alive in the late 16th century. And this spectacular example of his work is preserved by the Goldsmiths Guild in the City of London. Interestingly, it was in the collection of Lord Swathling, a pioneer collector of Huguenot silver, who was also a banker of Jewish extraction. So I think it's interesting that a Jewish plutocrat is collecting works by previous generation of immigrants to Great Britain. Thinking of Huguenot icons, this remarkable equestrian statue, Charles I, was the work of Hubert Le Sueur, whose father was an armorer in Paris. And I think you can see the son's familiarity with representing armor in sculpture. And of course, this celebrated statue, which was of course taken down during the interregnum, during the Civil War, concealed and reinstalled in its present location at Charing Cross, today just south of Trafalgar Square. But again, something to look out for when you're next in London. Well, during the 16th century, Huguenots made a very important contribution to the luxury trades, particularly watchmaking, jewelry, and goldsmiths work. And this spectacular jeweled watch case contains a movement signed by David Bouquet, who was also closely connected with the French Protestant Church in Threadneedle Street. I think this is a breathtaking combination of enamel decoration set with diamonds. There are in fact 92 foil-backed diamonds set in this glorious complement of enameled flowers. Even the dial and the inside of the case are enameled with exquisite landscapes. David Bouquet also made this silver-cased lantern clock, presumably a special commission. And he made time to be an elder, an ancien of the French church in Threadneedle Street on 4 occasions for 3 years each, between 1637 and 1662. He was closely involved with the founding and setting up of the Clockmakers Guild, which was founded in the early 1630s. And we know that Bouquet was in London from 1622. So Huguenot watches were often decorated with miniature portraits, and Geneva also produced some of the finest miniature artists working in enamel, a technique that had been developed in Blois and Châteaudun. Blois also a center of watchmaking. The most celebrated artist to work in miniature was Jean Petitot, who worked both at the English court and the French court, having trained in Geneva. And this exquisite self-portrait is really a brilliant advertisement for his sophistication. It's believed that he, Jean Petitot, concentrated on achieving the likeness of the face and relied on other assistants, possibly his brother-in-law, Jacques Bordier, to provide the hair, the draperies, and the backgrounds. And this particular example is unusual in that it retains its original frame, also enameled in black on gold. Well, Huguenots also worked as engravers. Indeed, many goldsmiths produce sets of engraved ornament, but it's intriguing to discover a rather remarkable set of satirical prints published within the decade that the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was signed. This series in the 1690s was published in Amsterdam by Jacob Gole. He was brother, I think, of the great Pierre Gole, who was Louis XIV's own cabinet maker. And here you see Louis XIV as the Sun King, but as the leader of the League to persecute the Protestants. Fascinatingly, there's a series of ivory satirical portraits based on these engravings, which a set has recently been acquired by the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and they are going to run an exhibition on Huguenot related artworks, which opens in August this year and will run for a whole year. So another reason to encourage you to come to Britain in the next year to catch that exhibition. Well, you will be familiar with this well-published in contemporary engraving showing Huguenot refugees leaving France, often in just the clothes they stood up in. There are amazing inherited stories of children being concealed in the baskets carried by horses and donkeys, or then being concealed in wine barrels while crossing the English Channel. And it is, I think, salutary to remember that here now in 2022, we are witnessing an unprecedented explosion of a refugee crisis from Ukraine. And even before that, there were 25,000 refugees who crossed the English Channel in 2021. That is the number of Huguenot refugees that London welcomed about the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So this is an ever-present crisis, and we need to remember that it was the Huguenots who introduced the term refugee into the English language. Well, French was the lingua franca, the language spoken in fashionable circles across Northern Europe. And it wasn't just the language, it was also the style of dress and the style of eating and drinking à la française. It's very intriguing to discover that one of the first Huguenot goldsmiths to be established in London, indeed 3 years before the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, Pierre Arrache, who came from Rouen, was 20 years later selling French wine from underneath his workshop in the West End of London, in Suffolk Street. This, of course, was at a time when Britain was at war with France, and it was illegal to import French wine directly from France. So it is likely that it was imported via Livorno in Italy. But it seemed appropriate to show this wine taster from the collection at the Huntington in San Marino in California, which dates from just 2 years after Arrache had settled in London and been accepted by the Goldsmiths Guild. Another early arrival before the revocation was Simon Griblin, who came from a family of clock and watchmakers in Blois. And Griblin joined the Clockmakers Guild by 1687 in London. But on arrival, he published a book of several ornaments that was intended for the use of jewelers and watchmakers and silversmiths. And Griblin became a distinguished engraver, engraving silver and engraving reproductive prints after old masters, including the Raphael cartoons and the extraordinary ceiling on the banqueting house, which had been painted by Peter Paul Rubens for Charles I in the second quarter of the 17th century. But notice the very vibrant acanthus scrollwork enlivened by these putti playing with attributes, a mini trident at the top, Putto riding a sort of shell sea chariot drawn by dolphins, and framing a trompe l'oeil textile representation of Apollo and Daphne turning into a laurel bush. Well, some of the Huguenot watchmakers took advantage of the signs of the times to make commemorative watches. David Le Sturgeon, a Huguenot refugee from Dieppe, was working in the West End of London near the Church of St. Martin in the Fields. I juxtapose here a copy of the Quiet Conquest catalogue of the exhibition on the Huguenots supported by the Huguenot Society in 1985 and mounted at the Museum of London. And in the center of the screen, the silver pear case watch by Le Sturgeon has a memorial bust of William III on the back of the movement, as does the example on the right, which is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And at the bottom is a similar watch, but this time celebrating the accession of the new monarch, Queen Anne. And this, also by David Le Sturgeon, can be seen in the British Museum. Another refugee from Dieppe, François Asselin, produced this spectacular clock, probably for a Spanish royal commission, showing, again, appropriate for Eastertide, the figure of the risen Christ, flanked by 4 kneeling apostles. And the case is decorated with scenes from the New Testament, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the descent from the cross. A spectacular piece that was originally in the Time Museum, Rockford, Illinois, sold in New York, Sotheby's, in 2002. Well, just reminding you that, of course, these elaborate timepieces needed sophisticated cases, and amongst the Huguenot refugees were a number of cabinet makers and clock case makers. I show you here the remarkable flooring of Parquet de Versailles, parquetry flooring, made by the Huguenot carpenter Pierre Riusset, who also specialized in making billiard tables. And this is the floor leading to the state apartments at Boughton House in Northamptonshire, which was decorated for Ralph Montague, Charles II's ambassador to the court of Louis XIV at Versailles. Montague made a point of patronizing Huguenot refugee artists and craftsmen at his great London house, Montague House, Bloomsbury, which became the first home of the British Museum in the mid-18th century, and here at Boughton in Northamptonshire, which is often known as the English Versailles, well worth visiting. Another great house that benefited from Huguenot skill is Durham near Bath, now the property of the National Trust. It was designed for William Blaithwaite, William III's Secretary of State, and the architect of this, the West Front, was Samuel Bauduroy, member of a talented family, also from Paris. But Samuel had a problem. His grasp of English was not good enough to be able to instruct the workmen. And in fact, the other facade was carried out by William Talman, an English and Catholic architect, as it happens. Well, here is a fine example of another commemorative clock, table clock, by John Constantin, who appears to have been working in Spitalfields. There are 2 clockmakers of this name, father and son. And you can see here the Act of Union between England and Scotland is commemorated by the Royal Crown presiding over the English rose and the Scottish thistle. Well, Huguenot contribution to culture is often associated particularly with silk weaving and with silver. And I wanted to share with you this recently identified portrait given to the Victoria and Albert Museum by Paul Minette, who was closely involved with the French hospital as its treasurer. He bought it at Sotheby's, and it was only subsequently identified as the great silk merchant and designer James Lemon, who came from a family of Huguenots established first in Canterbury, where there had been a Huguenot chapel and community worshipping from the late 16th century, from the 1570s. And in fact, a Huguenot community still meets in Canterbury Cathedral on Sunday afternoons to celebrate evensong on a weekly basis. So James Lemon was based in Stewart Street in Spitalfields, and the V&A has a remarkable album of his designs, over 90 designs, which are spectacular and really deserve reproduction. I feel we should persuade Hermes to produce a collector's silk scarf based on Lemon's design. So if anybody listening has contacts at Hermes, please get in touch. And then there were others associated with the Huguenot community who in fact were of English heritage. So Louis Barber was born in Poitou to an English emigre father. Poitou, of course, was the scene of the Dragonnat when Catholic troops were billeted on the Huguenot population and forced them to convert. So it's no surprise that he came back to England with his family and became the leading supplier of guns for the royal armaments. And in fact, the Duke of Montague's son and heir, John, second Duke of Montague, was master of the ordnance and employed Louis Barber to arrange the private armory in a decorative pattern at Boughton, for which documentary evidence survives, and several examples of Barber's skill as a gunsmith. Well, having a fashionable watch was something to show off about. And I show you here this rather charming sketch, once attributed to William Hogarth, of Martin Folkes and Joseph Addison's two fashionable men about town meeting at Button's Coffee House in Russell Street, Covent Garden. And Martin Folkes is studying his watch with the use of an eyeglass. There are a range of special featured watches, this Wandering Hour watch by Etienne Boisson, who appears to have worked both in London and Geneva, although sometimes London was put on watches made in Geneva because in the 18th century, the prestige of a London-made watch even superseded those made in the Swiss city. And as more refugees arrived in London, the existing churches, including that granted to the Huguenots by Charles II in the 1660s at the Savoy, were not sufficient to accommodate increasing numbers. And so in 1685, Christopher Wren was invited to design an extension to the French church at the Savoy. And some 30 years later, new sacred silver was supplied in order to meet the demands of a still increasing community. And the silver was made by Louis Cuny and is today preserved at the French hospital in Rochester. And this is from an extraordinary contemporary publication, The Religious Ceremonies of the World, which illustrates the whole range of religions, even including Freemasonry, which you can hardly be described today as a religion. Bernard Picard was a Catholic who converted to Protestantism in 1709, a real year of crisis in France, when there was a shortage of food and an economic slump on a huge scale. Picard left Paris and settled in Amsterdam as a Protestant. And then this remarkable publication preoccupied him for the next 20 years or so. Well, I'm sharing with you today two clocks which are to be seen in the Garrick Club. Of course, David Garrick, that celebrated actor who did so much to revive Shakespeare in the 18th century, was of Huguenot heritage. His father from Bordeaux, and David himself actually started his career as a wine merchant, then discovered a talent for acting, which took over, and the rest is history. And in fact, the Huguenot Museum in Rochester takes the Garrick family as a theme for its storyline. This long case clock was supplied by Claude Duchesne, an outstanding maker from Paris, who also specialized in musical clocks. The Garrick Club has very little information on how they acquired these two Huguenot clocks. And I'm hoping that by showing them tonight to those with particular interest in clocks, we can raise the profile of their importance to the curators at that club. Well, there were engravers who specialized in providing the names for clock dials, and Isaac Bazier settled in St. John's Court in Clerkenwell, which even from the 1730s had become a center for the clock and watchmaking industry in London. Another dynasty, he was succeeded by his son, John Bazier, and another, James Bazier, the third generation, is better remembered for being the master of the celebrated artist, William Blake. James Bazier was engraver to the Society of Antiquaries, and William Blake, as a youngster, helped to draw the effigies in Westminster Abbey for his master to engrave for an antiquarian publication. Another dynasty was that founded by Daniel and Thomas Grignon, also from Paris, in Russell Street, Covent Garden. Interestingly, Daniel, who came to London as a child of 4 in 1688, worked first with the great British clockmaker Daniel Quare in the city before setting up on his own with his son, born in 1713. So this trade card probably dates from a little bit later than 1720. This is an example by father and son, a movement in the British Museum. And in fact, this watch originally had a very sophisticated case chased by George Michael Moser, a leading German artist who settled in London. So London attracted talented craftsmen from across Europe, but numerically, the Huguenots were the most influential. Here is a rather wonderful drawing of Thomas Grignon by his elder brother Charles, who was an artist and engraver, 1737. Thomas had just returned from Paris. Indeed, it was possible to remain in Paris as a Protestant and keep a low profile, although there were moments of renewed persecution. Interestingly, the family name was Grignon and was anglicized by adding the I, as it's easier to pronounce in English. The British Museum has a number of bills from Thomas Grignon to leading clients. The Countess of Plymouth, for example, thought it was quite interesting to see how much it cost to mend a watch in 1757, 17 shillings. A repeating watch by Grignon broke by a fall. And there are further bills in the British Museum to Edward Turner, for cleaning and mending, or providing a gold chain, £5, 15 shillings and sixpence, or a lady's gold chain with 5 swivels, £6, 16 shillings. Even a watch key cost 2 shillings and sixpence. And you can see repairs to watches that are made by previous makers, Harvey and Freeman. And that in 1756 demonstrates that Thomas Grignon is still working alongside his father. His will in, I think, 1784, Thomas Grignon appoints Jeremiah Meyer and a leading bookseller, Thomas Cadell, as his executors. And Jeremiah Meyer is a leading portrait miniaturist working in enamels. And you can see the links between watchmaking and miniature painting are still flourishing by the later 18th century. There are 2 long case clocks in fine marquetry cases in the V&A collections. I particularly like that of Henry Poisson, who's had premises in the Royal Exchange in the heart of City of London, and his business was succeeded by his son, who anglicised the name, family name, from Poisson to fish. Or Daniel Lecount, another fine marquetry case. Lecount came from Rouen. He too was working in the City of London and served as a deacon and elder at the Threadneedle Street Church. Or Claude Viette, who came from Orléans and specialised in musical clocks. Here is a fine example on loan to the Lime Park property in Cheshire National Trust. And the trade card of Mary Ann Viette and Claude Viette's son-in-law, Thomas Mitchell, again, working as toy shop, selling not just clocks, but also a whole range of luxury goods. Mary Ann Viette was in fact the first woman known to be an apprentice within the Clockmakers Company. She was Claude Viette's niece, but named after her aunt, who was also Mary Ann. So untangling the different generations requires the skill of a professional genealogist. Another celebrated Huguenot firm, the de Beaufort, were based in Clerkenwell. And here is an example in the V&A by the second generation, James de Beaufort. They were associated with the innovation of using jewels in the movement of watches, and attempted to produce a patent for that in 1704, which was in fact vetoed by the Clockmakers Company, an indication of some of the resentment that these talented immigrants attracted from native makers. Occasionally, a will of one of these clockmakers sheds extraordinary light on both the loyalty to the Huguenot organization. So the French church in Savoy has a legacy of £10, so does the French church in Needle Street. There's a legacy to the newly established Huguenot Hospital, now called Providence, and to the Watchmakers Company. But his close associates in the horological world received examples of his best repeating gold watches, including the jeweler Michael Garneau. And by scrutinizing the text of this will, you get an indication of the range and geographical distribution of the various beneficiaries of Joseph Paulet's will. Paulet actually specialized in making extraordinary traveling clocks. The one on the right is in the V&A, and I show you the back of the example in the Metropolitan Museum on the left, beautifully engraved. One of them has the royal monogram of Queen Anne and may well have been intended as a royal gift. Well, I've mentioned the bequest to Michael Garneau, the jeweler, who also received Paulette's Latin and other books. And here is a portrait of Michael Garneau by the very talented Huguenot refugee carver, David Lemarchand, now in the Art Gallery of Ontario. Well, Louis Charon, extremely talented artist trained at the French Academy in Paris, came to London in 1693 to work for Ralph Montague at Montague House in Bloomsbury and at Boughton. Some 20 years later, he established the St. Martin's Lane Academy, which provided an opportunity for apprentices and others to draw from the live model in the evening. Here is an earlier life drawing by Charon when he was attending Sir Godfrey Kneller's academy. But Charon introduced the opportunity of drawing from the female model for the first time, and it was 100 years before the French Academy was able to offer similar facilities. Interestingly, the opportunity attracted interest from the Prince of Wales in November 1722, who witnessed artists drawing the female model and then gave the model 5 guineas for her trouble. Well, for light relief, you could go to the Turkish baths down the road from St. Martin's Lane, just behind Longacre, which were run by Francis Verdier. Interestingly, his father was one of King George II's cooks, Marc Verdier. And we know probably his brother was based in South Carolina. So fascinating links across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, silver has been mentioned as one of the areas in which the Huguenots excelled. And I was thrilled that we were able to acquire this pair of double-lipped silver sauce boats, very much a Huguenot form, made by Anne Tanqueray, the daughter of David Villaume, one, well, probably the very first French Huguenot woman goldsmith to be recorded in London. And I'm intrigued that the form of these sauce boats is mirrored by a pair made in New York City by the Huguenot émérité goldsmith Charles Leroux in the 1720s. So almost at the same time. And these are now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Well, I've mentioned the French hospital, La Providence. Here is a contemporary engraving from Maitland's History of London. The hospital was unique in that it provided shelter for those suffering from mental health issues at a time where otherwise they might be confined to Bedlam and visited as entertainment rather than caring for their well-being. The French hospital attracted this gift from leading Huguenot clockmaker Charles Cabrier in 1752. The clock adorned the director's meeting room. And I show you on the left a very fine embossed case by containing a movement by Cabrier, which is in the Metropolitan Museum. Well, Huguenot merchants commissioned from their own community, and of course, Paul de Lamry is the most famous name associated with Huguenot silver. This is a sophisticated tea equipage that was commissioned by Jacques-Louis Bercher for the marriage of his daughter to the son of a fellow Huguenot jeweler. And this is at Temple Newsome House in Leeds. So at the heart of the Huguenot community in the city was the French church in Threadneedle Street. And here in 1739, its 1641 discipline was reproduced in this beautiful illuminated edition, overseen by Henri Guinon, whose portrait is on the left, who was by then deputy governor of the French hospital. Here is the other Huguenot clock in the Garrick Club. John Crucifix is certainly the son of Robert, clockmaker working in Spitalfields from the late 17th century. And if you remember the clock with which we started this talk at Hampton Court, I believe that this exquisite mantle clock, commissioned from the Huguenot goldsmith Peter Dutens by Frederick, Prince of Wales in 1736, was a deliberate attempt to capture that exquisite and sophisticated piece by Nicholas Also, probably made as a wedding present for Frederick, Prince of Wales, who married Augusta in London in 1736. Equally sophisticated, a few years later, this lapis lazuli cased watch was sold by toy shop owner Paul Daniel Chenevix to the first Duke of Newcastle. The movement has Chenevix's name on the back, although the clock and watch movement were probably supplied by a subcontractor. And it was a Huguenot watchmaker who was responsible for inventing the pile driving engine, which helped to construct the first bridge at Westminster. And again, there are intriguing links between watchmakers and engineers and scientists. Daniel Grignon and Charles Laboulaye, the engineer behind the first bridge at Westminster, all belong to the same Masonic lodge that met in Hemmings Row, very close to St. Martin in the Fields. Well, I mentioned the French hospital founded in the early 18th century. Some 30 years later, David Hubert, a leading clock and watchmaker whose portrait is preserved in the French hospital collection, founded the French Protestant Charity School in Westminster in 1747. The subscription ticket was engraved by Charles Grignon, the elder brother of Thomas Grignon, and you can see an example of a watch signed by David Hubert from the British Museum, lower right. I thought you would enjoy seeing this remarkable survival, a doll in the uniform of that school, dating from the late 18th century, I think at the time that the Huguenot Society of America was founded. And this is a treasured possession in the Huguenot Museum on loan from the Huguenot Ouvry family, which was conserved specially to be displayed in the new museum when it opened in 2015. And just to remind you that it was Huguenot Charles Goun who was co-founder of the Chelsea porcelain manufactory in the mid-1740s in London with Nicholas Sprimont, an immigrant from Catholic Liège. And this figure of the wet nurse, which is based on the French 16th century prototype, seemed an appropriate way of representing that extraordinary entrepreneurial achievement. So this is London in the mid-18th century, and the population was just about 600,000. It's thought some 25,000 Huguenots made London their home in that period, and as many again, another 25,000, possibly even more, settled across the British Isles. Many, of course, moved on to the New World. But it is by studying documents such as the Pew List of the French Protestant Church and Threadneedle Street, now preserved in the library of the French Church in Soho Square. You can see top right the name of Jacques Lemon, James Lemon, the sophisticated Huguenot silk merchant and designer. I would urge you to go and explore the holdings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art on your doorstep. Here's another example of the Perigal family, exquisitely combining watchmaking and jewelry. And here is the clock that Francis Perigal II presented for the use of the French church in Threadneedle Street. In fact, it replaced another Huguenot clock made by Lemaire that was given to that church in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So here it is still in the library of the French Protestant Church in Soho Square, built in the late 19th century, which is the successor to the Threadneedle Street Church, still used regularly for French Protestant worship in the heart of London. Well, one of the extraordinary innovations of Huguenot watchmaking is the idea of personalizing your watch. If you happen to have 12 letters in your first given and family name combined, you can create a personalized dial replacing Roman numerals. I have 12 letters in my given and surname, so I think this could be an exciting initiative for the Huguenot Museum to pursue. Here is the watch and here is the owner, both from the Huguenot Museum collection. Many of these watchmakers became extremely well off, and an indication of their riches is shown in the sale of the collection of Isaac Duhamel, possibly connected to the Pierre Duhamel, whose watch from Geneva is also in the Met's collection. Or John Stephen Rambo, who specialized in making musical clocks and was painted out of gratitude by Johann Zoffany, appropriately holding some music, perhaps adapted for his musical clocks, portrait dating from 1764 in the collection of the Tate. Interestingly, it was to a Huguenot goldsmith that Sir Thomas Hankey turned when commissioning sacred silver for the asylum for female orphans. Thomas Hankey's partner in business was Henri Guinon, whose portrait we saw, deputy governor of the French hospital. His was his son, a member of the family. So when looking for a Huguenot silversmith, there was an obvious recommendation. And Abraham Portal was the apprentice of Paul de Lamery. Another later example, James Tregent, whose brother made wonderfully personalized trinkets in enamel boxes celebrating the new year. Tregent was a clockmaker to the royal family, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, and his brother, the Duke of Kent. Or the extravagant automata and clocks that were made specifically for export to the Far East, particularly China. Here is a remarkable drawing by Charles Magnac, who worked with James Cox. Magnac also forming another Huguenot dynasty. In fact, this drawing in the V&A was used to identify the base, which had become separated from this extraordinary bull clock. Or another spectacular confection made by a French clockmaker in Clerkenwell, bringing together contributions from probably as many as 1,000 different specialists. Although Hubert Martinet, the coordinator of this commission, was not Huguenot, it was displayed in a Huguenot jeweler's shop in Coventry Street, Haymarket, as the newspapers record. You paid anything up to 2 shillings and 6pence admission to see this marvel, the elephant who exhibited natural motions of trunk, eyes, ears, and tail. But you might also buy a watch by George Graham while you were in the jeweler's shop. And usually we have a portrait of the owner of the shop, Louis Masquerier, drawn in Paris by his son and his trade card, both in the British Museum. And I'm going to end with this remarkable example by John Duval, leading merchant jewelers based in London, Geneva, and St. Petersburg. John Duval actually supplied George III with a machine so that he could turn ivory, a lathe. So this box has ivory ornament turned by the king and was subsequently presented to the royal collection by John Duval's grandson. So I end by reminding you that the Huguenot Museum in Rochester, Kent, is supported by the officers and directors of the French hospital and also by the fellows of the Huguenot Society of Great Britain and Ireland. Here is the French hospital now in Rochester, Kent, celebrating its tercentenary in 1718. And here is the Huguenot Museum, just across the way from the station, easy of access from London. It's just perhaps a 40-minute journey or 20-minute journey by high-speed train. So the first thing you see is the garden that leads to the museum, which could easily be turned into a specialist Huguenot garden, and then the entrance to the Huguenot Museum from Rochester High Street. A glimpse inside the museum, portraits of the Lihup and Fenouillet and Grelier families await your visit. And I end with this glorious glimpse of the Huguenots' garden within the precinct of the French hospital, designed by former president of the Huguenot Society of Great Britain and Ireland, Lady Emma Munson. Thank you very much for your patience. I very much hope to be able to welcome you to Rochester, and I hope that you will let me know if you are planning a visit to London and the United Kingdom.
Tessa, that was absolutely fabulous. What visual treasures, and so beautifully and eloquently presented. It was such a fabulous lecture, and I think we will all be, hopefully, at some point in our lives, visiting Rochester.
Excellent.
Really, yes, indeed. So thank you so much. I am going to open up to Q&A, but Victoria, do you want to say a few words? This is Victoria Dengle, our Executive Director, before we open up the Q&A.
Tessa, just what can I say? Stunning. And I sat here mesmerized by the work of the Huguenots, and I've never given it the subject that, as you've opened up my eyes to another world, or our eyes, I should say. And as you know, the Huguenots we have them right here in the building. I can't wait to have a look at the library tomorrow. And I'm so grateful to you. And, you know, as I was listening and watching, I couldn't help but think of the world today. And may I say, while we're talking about these wonderful creations, you know, hundreds of years later, I think how I was thinking about how much time people spend with, may I say, Instagram and all of these things that will never, they won't be reviewed in quite the same way. And I just feel so rich after this lecture. For my father always told me I was born rich, not because of material goods, but because of what people left me to look at and enjoy and respect. And I thank you, Tessa, for bringing this all into full view with such thoroughness, intelligence. And I do have a question.
Please, far ahead.
With the Huguenots, you have several books. What first inspired you?
Ah, yes, I should really have said that first of all. I have Huguenot heritage on my mother's side. And I think probably about my 9 times great-grandfather was a goldsmith, Edward Felline, who was working in King Street, Covent Garden. And I have inherited some silver candlesticks with Felline's mark for 1728 to 9. And as a child, it was my responsibility to put the candles in the candlesticks on family occasions. And so the story of the Huguenot ancestor would come out. So when I was looking for a subject for my doctoral thesis, I was very interested in the French sculptor Louis-François Roubiliac, who does have Huguenot connections. But my supervisor, the wonderful Professor David Beinman, who's probably the other side, your side of the pond more often than he is here, wanted to do a monograph on Roubiliac. So he sent me away and said, but why were there so many French artists and craftsmen around in London when Roubiliac was working there? So I went away and I thought, yes, the Huguenot candlesticks. So that's why.
Fascinating. I love that. Thank you.
What a good question. Thank you so much for your words of appreciation.
Thank you so much, Tessa.
I will now take some questions from the audience, and I did see a couple of people had raised their hands. Could I trouble you to convert that into a typed question? But I'm going to start off. This is from Gail Quigley, and Gail is very enthusiastic about the lecture, and she also makes this comment. And I think that many of us who are perhaps less familiar with the impact of the Huguenots, she says, I had no idea of the Huguenot influence on the arts in London in the 1600s and 1700 centuries and beyond. And indeed, we could add to the world. You have really highlighted that, Tessa. Gail has a specific question. Her maiden name is Vermalia. According to the genealogy done back in the late 16th century, when her ancestor fled from France to London, many of her ancestors were baptized in the Walloon Church in London. They eventually came to Leiden in the Netherlands and finally to Amsterdam around 1660. Now she wonders if she goes to the museum in Kent, which I believe she does plan to do, would there be any documents that, of interest to her? Would you like me to spell her last name? I mean her maiden name.
I'm looking at the chat.
Yes.
So I've got that. Thank you. I would say that we at the Huguenot Museum offer assistance with family history research, and we would be delighted to help to guide Gail in her quest. And actually, in compiling my book, I had assistance from a very experienced genealogist, Sandra Robinson, who also has wonderful mastery of appropriate languages. So she has Dutch as well. So maybe, Gail, you have Dutch, but if you don't, Sandra might be a really good person to guide you, because she would be able to access archives in Leiden that would throw light on your family in the Netherlands, which, I mean, maybe something you've already mastered, but if not, I would happily put you in touch. So I would suggest that my email was on the first slide actually, but tessavmurdoch@gmail.com will reach me, as will also chair@huguenotmuseum.org. So please do feel free, and if anybody else has questions that spring to mind, perhaps after this evening's lecture, I'd be delighted to field them in writing.
Thank you, Tessa. That's extremely generous and thoughtful of you. This is a question from Mark Jacoby, and who's the male figure represented in the sculpture in the Rochester Garden in your last slide?
Very good question. It's Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, who of course was murdered at the time of the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572. I don't know if any of you into reading historical fiction, but Kate Moss is writing a quartet of novels about the Huguenots. And the latest one is called The City of Tears, and it is partially set in Paris at the time of the massacre of St. Bartholomew. And I had a very lively evening at the V&A on the 10th of March in conversation with Kate, in which I was trying to sketch the historical background to her novel. And in fact, the V&A has an extraordinary portrait of, or painting of, Catherine de' Medici with the decapitated head of Admiral de Coligny. It's a rather gruesome 19th century version of that tragedy. But I think that for the Huguenots who were experiencing dire persecution in the late 17th century, the memory of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, which has been described as one of the first documented genocides, when probably as many as 13,000 Protestants across France lost their lives, must have heightened their sense of need to leave France and make new lives elsewhere. So Gaspard de Coligny is a great Huguenot hero, and thank you very much for that question. It was only looking at my watch that I thought I'd better wind up and didn't mention his name. So.
We have a question from Kathleen Matthew. She explained what a wonderful lecture it is. Is there any extant Huguenot community or active church congregation in London or England?
Is there any active, just repeat again, active Huguenot community?
Sorry, yes, sorry. The question, is there any extant? Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. E-X-T-A-N-T?
Extant. No, I'm with you. That was the key word that I just needed to grasp.
Sorry.
Yes, well, I mentioned that the French Protestant church in Soho Square is the successor to the Threadneedle Street Church. So you can imagine the pressure on space in the city of London, the square mile, what was then very much the financial capital, was tremendous in the late 19th century when London really was the financial capital of the world. So the French Protestant Church moved out to Soho, which is actually rather appropriate given the very strong links with Soho and Huguenot communities in the late 17th century when that whole Soho area was being developed. So it is that French Protestant church in Soho Square that has the remarkable library, the Perigord clock, the documents I showed you, the pew list, and the illuminated copy of the police discipline of the church. So it's also well worth a visit if you are coming to the UK. And in fact, in the past, I've done a Huguenot walk through Soho, describing where some of the leading craftsmen, such as Paul de Lamery, worked, and you get a real sense of how close these craftsmen who, I've concentrated on the production of watches and clocks today, but they were mastery of so many different skills, and that's what I've tried to put across in the new book, is the way in which they sort of interlinked with their skills, something that they could not do so easily in France, where the specialist guilds were much more rigid about allowing craftsmen to diversify. Basically, they were not allowed to diversify.
No, how interesting. This is a question that brings us to the impact of the Huguenots on the New World. And particularly Paul Revere. This is a question and comment from Rebecca Moore. The Huguenot work shown this evening is very elaborate and sophisticated. However, Boston Huguenot silversmith Paul Revere was noted for his elegant and spare designs. How does his style relate to the more elaborate London style.
Thank you very much, Becky. As a friend from Rhode Island, which is wonderful to see you here this evening. Well, Paul Revere was producing silver in the second half of the 18th century. And I think it's fair to say that most of his surviving work falls into the neoclassical style, which is also by then dominant in London. And I think a key really here is the fact that we're witnessing yet another dynasty with the Revere family. Obviously, Paul succeeded to the business that was established by his father, Apollos Rivoire, as he was when he arrived in Boston to be apprenticed to John Coney. And I think the style in which Revere worked reflected the dictates of the market in Boston at the time. I'm thinking particularly of, I think it's a tea urn in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I think is 1790s. And if you look at the work of Louisa Courtauld, who is, well, second generation of the Courtauld dynasty working in London, the work is very similar. So I suspect the common ground really are the engraved ornament and even conversation pieces that show such silver in use. I can think of examples both by artists working in London and artists working in the New World. I think the way in which these pieces were commissioned for use is key to their appearance. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does very thoroughly, thank you. This is a question from Sarah Marsh. Many of the great 18th and early 19th century composers went to London and had large followings who paid to attend their concerts. Now she wonders, do you think the Huguenot jewelers were in London producing all the great pieces because the audience was there in the same way? I'm presuming Sarah means because it was such an artistic, flourishing center and perhaps wealthy attendees as well. Was that a reason that they might have settled in London?
I think they settled in London because there was a key market, but that market was not limited to Londoners. I think what I tried to imply by showing particularly the pieces that were designed for the Far East, for the Chinese market, is the extraordinary international market that was, shall we say, manipulated from London. So in his remarkable book, The London Tradesman, which is a kind of guide to the different options available for parents looking to apprentice their son, Robert Campbell says that actually, if you are a watchmaker or a clockmaker, you can earn a living anywhere in the world. And I think it's very interesting that the leading goldsmiths, Paul Crespin, whose name I didn't mention this evening, or Paul de Lamery, their daughters marry into clock and watchmaking families. So Paul de Lamery's daughter marries into the de Beauf family. Paul Crespin's daughter marries Francis Gabriel Barrow. That's a name I didn't raise tonight. But the watchmakers are, in a sense, the new silversmiths in terms of the extraordinary international market that opens up. I mean, the sheer numbers of watches that were being produced in London at this period, right into the early 19th century, is astonishing. And also, I think, the sophistication of the London community. We focused on Huguenot makers this evening, but there were many other nationalities producing skilled craftsmen who came to London because of the extraordinary opportunity for cross-fertilization between the different trades, as well as the flourishing market. So, you know, I could have given the lecture on Swiss watchmakers in London, not just in Geneva, or German craftsmen who were working. I mentioned George Michael Moser, but one of the Cabrier gold case that I showed you, that is marked by a German sounding goldsmith. So London is a melting pot of foreign talent, which of course, although the natives initially were very resistant, was an incredible opportunity. You know, if you can't beat them, hire them. So you get a foreign journeyman working for you. And then you can compete because you have the skills in your workshop.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you for that awesome answer. This will be our last question tonight. The elephant clock at Waddesdon Manor is extraordinary, as it was. That's really breathtaking. Is it still fully animated? And how many people were involved with its design? I think you said 1,000. Was that correct?
Well, that's an estimate. It is still animated. I think it plays, maybe it's one afternoon a month now, because I was fortunate to be in residence at Waddesdon Manor in 2019. I was able to make sure that I witnessed it working. There is, I think, planned a special monograph on that extraordinary automaton by Jonathan Betts and Roger Smith, who are both leading experts in the field of horology. Have I answered all the questions? I'm trying to remember what else. Oh, 1,000. Yes, I mean, that, you know, that's the estimate. But I think what it indicates is the extraordinary complexity of the watchmaking trade. And if you refer to Robert Campbell's The London Tradesman, it indicates, you know, the range of special skills and specialities that went to produce just a watch. So when it comes to a very sophisticated automaton with, you know, an elephant with ears flapping, eyes going from side to side, round the bottom there are flowers that kind of open and shut, and figures that do a procession round the base. There's a wonderful story about the Shah of Persia staying at Waddesdon and having eyes for nothing else but the elephant automaton. And you can see why. And of course, it's the most brilliant ambassador for those extraordinary rich Rothschild collections in the manor, because it appeals to all ages now, as it did then when Mascari and Perigal were charging 2 shillings and 6pence for admission to their jeweller's shop.
Gosh, wow. Tessa, I'm also presuming, I mean, Tessa's wonderful book, and I want to mention to you, the audience again, how absolutely splendid and gorgeous this book is. And I do want to mention that I will send out a link when I send out the lecture, but I do want to mention that it is available online at bookshop.org. And if you put in the title, Europe Divided, Huguenot Refugee Arts and Culture, and that is a place to support independent booksellers as well. But what I was going to say is just that, like, it must have been, I mean, as I said, I believe it reflected 40 years of your research, but it must have been a very difficult decision of what to include in that wonderful, magnificent volume.
It was a challenge, I think, to be confronted by the amazing opportunity to go out to the Getty for 3 months and then to be in residence at Waddesdon and to think, oh, but I can't take my own personal library and notes. And I thought at the time, but this is madness. But in fact, to be kind of freed from all that paraphernalia and just to have to think effectively. You know, the book had to be written within 2 years, so I had a contract. So it's that precise timing. You know, it could have the cake could have been cut in so many different ways. And obviously there was some illustrations that I had selected that weren't available. There was also the whole question of the book, which I think you'll agree has been beautifully designed by Robert Dalrymple, who's really the leading art book designer, certainly on this side of the pond. And I think that it has worked out very beautifully from the point of view of design. And, you know, in fact, I mean, I showed the ivory of the jeweler Garneau. You know, I discovered that after the book had gone to print. I mean, I knew of it. It was in the Quiet Conquest exhibition, but I didn't know that it was now in the Art Gallery Ontario and could have been illustrated. But, you know, probably the book could be done all over again with a whole lot of different illustrations. But I think there's nothing like almost having a gun to your head and knowing that the book has got to be written. Of course, the COVID lockdown was actually a blessing because I got an extra 6 months, and I'm not sure that I could have done it in just 2 years. But I think it helps having worked on the subject on and off for 40 years, because you know, it can also be a disadvantage, because if there's too much detail, you know, it would be unreadable. But I think it probably is just about readable. Certainly, well, as a book of reference, it stands.
It's incredible. Such a fabulous presentation. Such a wonderful book. I'm going to ask Victoria if she has anything else she would like to say. But someone was asking about getting a book plate possibly for the book, and we won't go into that logistically now, Tessa, but I do.
No, well, I would be willing, and because in fact, you know, I was supposed to be in Charleston last week, and my talk for the Huguenot Society South Carolina has been postponed to October, when I plan to be there in person. But of course, I would be willing if you want to send over some book plates, or if it's helpful, I could ask the V&A. I know they do have them. If I could have some and then send them to you to save the crossing the pond twice with a parcel of book plates. So, you know, let me know if there is a demand for that. I'd be very happy to do that. I would also like to add that the Huguenot Museum is, I believe, going to be able to reopen in June. And we hope we can certainly continue to be open this year. But it is post-COVID, very, very challenging time, and we will be applying for grants and so on. But if anybody listening has any suggestions as to possible sources of funding or collaboration, or who might, you know, be interested in supporting the museum in some way. I'm very excited that we've had our first pledge of a legacy, and also in conversation a couple of weeks ago with a dealer. He just sold a painting of one of the Kent properties that belonged to a retired carver and gilder, Gideon Saint, whose wonderful pattern book is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He lived at Grumbridge Place in Kent, and this is a painting of Grumbridge Place. And the new owner in California has agreed to bequeath the painting to the museum. So there are some very exciting new initiatives and developments, but we do really desperately need help, support, ideas, advice. And I would love to hear from any of you who can offer anything in that line. So my email address for the museum is chair@huguenotmuseum.org. And I would love to be able to welcome each and every one of you in person when you're next able to cross the pond. So please remember that. And thank you for listening to my special plea.
thank you again to express our gratitude that you should so eloquently share your expertise and basically highlight the wealth of treasures created by the Huguenot community. Victoria, anything else you'd like to add?
Tessa, you're a tribute to your heritage and your ancestry, and you created a gift for the world at large, and that the book you've created should help in the pursuit of, financial support, because you've quite made the case. You're
Thank you.
hard to resist. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Karen, Victoria, Angelo, Meg, and also Jason Bernhardt, the president of the Huguenot Society, for giving me this opportunity. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope to see you in person in due course.
We absolutely hope that, and I'm just going to again thank you, Tessa, for acknowledging people, particularly Angelo and Meg, who are behind the scenes. And again, I want to express our thanks to Jason for his lovely introduction. And of course, I do also want to mention our partners tonight. That of course includes the Huguenot Society of America, the Horological Society of New York, and the historic Huguenot Street. Thank you all so much for attending tonight. We look forward to seeing you at future lectures. The next one is on May the 3rd. And if you just give me 1 second, I will remind you what that is. And that is, by design, the life and work of the artist Dietrich. Again, Tessa, many thanks to our online audience. Thank you so much for participating tonight. Good night.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.